right. Well, good morning.
Morning.
Glad that you all are here. As I mentioned, we were going to be talking about structuring the sermon, and you may be here just because you're interested in that. That's great. Most of the time when we talk about preaching or we think about good preaching, we don't necessarily think about structure. We think about beautiful poetic language. We think about, persons that are maybe have sort of a boisterous personality, or maybe even if they have a sort of reserved kind of demeanor, the way that they say things just captivates the imagination. And so when we tend to think of preaching, we don't really generally think about sermon structures. It's sort of if we do think of sermon structure at all, it's pretty minimal. And I think that's really pretty unfortunate. Sermon structures can help us a lot. And in fact, all of our communication is in some way structured. We don't always really think about the structures because they've been sort of handed down to us. And so because we are constantly using them, we're just unaware of them. So a great example in the ways that even a particular kind of medium of communication can use different structures for different kinds of information or different kinds of impact in terms of the audience is a newspaper. For those that might not be familiar with newspapers, maybe see an online article or something like that. So think of maybe even within the medium of like Facebook. Facebook has different kinds of structures that are operational even in it. But thinking of a newspaper, as you read a newspaper, what are the different kinds of sections or different kinds of structures that are used in a newspaper? Different ways that information is communicated in a newspaper.
Front page.
Okay, like the headlines, that has a particular kind of structure to it. It's sort of usually narrative to some degree. Maybe with even a picture to start off with to kind of grab your attention. Even the font that sometimes gets used in that. The headline might have a larger font or something like that to kind of grab your attention. What else?
Editorial page.
The editorial page, yeah. So it has maybe opinion or kind of an argument or something along those lines. What else?
Classifieds.
The classifieds. Short snippets. They just get right to the information. Here's what you need to know. It's this. Here's the contact info. So yeah, there's that kind of really quick small ad for the classifieds. What else?
Sports.
Sports. Yeah, that's a big one, right? So yeah, sports has its own, usually again, kind of narrative, but it might have like a synopsis of the game, kind of the highlights of the game, something like that. So it's sort of a quick play-by-play. Here's what happened, and here were the big moments in that event. What else?
Comics.
Comics, yes. I mean, who doesn't love the comics? And the comics are sort of short, pithy, usually in maybe 2, 3, sometimes only one frame. Where you have this really succinct idea communicated in a way that's sort of funny, unexpected.
Sometimes poignant.
Sometimes poignant, yeah. If you're maybe reading Peanuts or something like that, they may have something kind of poignant, weirdly enough. So yeah, there's even within just a newspaper, one particular place that everything is sort of bound up together. Within that is all sorts of different structures that are facilitating different kinds of information and impacting us in different kinds of ways. So when we think about preaching and the neglect of just paying attention to what sermon structures can do, I think one of the things that we lose out on is the way that we might be able to communicate information differently, as well as to shape the particular kinds of expectations and experiences of those who are listening. So there's that sort of general piece. In addition to that, one of the things that we don't pay attention to, especially as we're working with sermon structures, is that within every sermon structure, there is some sort of assumption about the human person and how it will be best to teach or to shape them in this particular kind of moment. So, for instance, if I believe that the sermon is primarily for instructing believers, for teaching them head knowledge. My sermon structure will probably follow that. It will probably be very didactic, kind of a teaching sort of approach. It will probably be something where I'm building points, perhaps. So I will sort of stair-step that. It'll be deductive. So we may start from a very small point to a very large general point. So if I think that the primary purpose of worship and preaching is to primarily to shape the mind, maybe that becomes the approach. Or if I'm a little bit more intentional and I realize my people need to be taught in this particular moment, maybe I use that structure in a way to do that kind of activity rather than that activity kind of shaping me and how I approach preaching. So is that making sense a little bit? The other piece is that structures carry with them theology. There's usually an implicit theology within the structure. So one, you may not be familiar with this, that's okay. Have anybody heard of 4 pages of the sermon?
Yes.
That's a fairly typical one that gets taught in a lot of, especially introduction courses. So the 4 pages, it can kind of go a couple different ways, but I'll give it a sort of just brief one. So there's the problem in the text. There's the grace in the text. Then they move to the problem in the world and grace in the world. So this sort of 4-step process in the sermon carries with it a particular theological tradition, which could be good or bad depending on how you utilize it, but to be aware that those assumptions are also being drawn in as we're preaching through sermon structure. So this is actually a very Lutheran approach to preaching. The way that most Lutherans would talk about it, especially Luther himself, would talk about law and grace, right? We deal with the law, you got to know where sin is, and then you deal with the grace. What is the grace of the text? Not what we have done, but what God has done. So essentially that maps out, right? The problem would be the law. Where is the brokenness in the world or brokenness in the text? Where are people falling short of the glory of God? And then how does God's glory or God's grace or God's mercy or whatever it might be, or even God's judgment, but where is God acting? So the law and grace piece of that. Now, as Wesleyans, for some of us who have that sort of background, we may not necessarily want to communicate that as being our primary theological framework for every text. But if this is the sermon structure that we're using, that's actually what we're reaffirming in some implicit kind of way, under the surface at least. Now, negatively, what this could also play out into, to go beyond just like Lutheran theology, is that if there's a problem in the world, then what the text does is solve it. And so for every nail that we have, the gospel, the scriptures become a hammer to nail that nail down. So if we're talking about problem and solution, that becomes really problematic, and it becomes a way for manipulating people to get certain kinds of ends. And so depending on how we understand those kinds of structures to be operating, the way that we then proclaim the gospel can be shaped, sometimes in very negative, maybe even unintended kinds of consequences or in sort of ways. Everybody with me so far? Mm-hmm. Hopefully I'm not being too confusing. So essentially, all I'm trying to say is that every structure carries with it some assumption of how people are shaped, some sort of assumption about who God is and how God acts in the sermon, and begins to shape the way that we proclaim that word and how it is received by those who are listening, because the structures begin to shape our expectation for what is actually gospel and what we are called to be and to do in those kinds of moments. So I'll go away from the 4 pages for a little bit. Now, that's not to say we should never use 4 pages or anything like that, but what I want to say is that when we are using sermon structures, when we are beginning to do the work of thinking how do we say these kinds of things that we find in the text, sometimes it is better to have a bunch of tools and structures that you can utilize for different kinds of purposes. Whether that is, I need to teach in this kind of moment, maybe my people are biblically illiterate in this kind of area, maybe there's some doctrinal kinds of issues that I need to address, so maybe a teaching is going to be appropriate in this context. Maybe I need to inspire and to bring people into kind of a poetic, imaginative space so that it's not just, here's the hammer and the nail kind of situation, that this is a problem and here's the solution. But sometimes some problems are so deep and pervasive that we don't have answers for them in the moment. All that we are left with is sort of the mystery of God being present in the midst of those kinds of things. And so we want to help people enter into that mystery without sort of just making it just sort of a self-help kind of thing or a pep talk or whatever that might be. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So I want to actually hand out a resource. This comes from a number of different texts. Some of them I've put together myself. But these are some different kinds of ways that you might be able to image structure and how those structures could be done. Some of them you may be familiar with if you've read much preaching text. So,
You forgot your own line.
and you live with me. You know what I'm doing on that. So again, there's just a variety of ways that structures can be put together. Some of these are sort of expository, so kind of more of the old style, for instance, the exegesis, interpretation, application box in the top left-hand corner begins with an introduction. Then you exegete a text. So this, again, would kind of maybe be sort of a teaching kind of methodology. So here's me exegeting what the text is saying, maybe doing some of the language study or the culture kinds of issues. And then my interpretation of that work. So now we're beginning to show them how we do the work from looking at the kind of basics of the exegetical work to then how do I begin to understand that. And then the application. So if this is what's going on in the text and this is how I understand it, this is how we begin to apply it to this particular context of our church or our ministry or whatever it might be. So that's very deductive. That's very teaching kind of methodology.
Did you say that was the old exegesis interpretation? That's the way I was taught to preach, so I'd like to thank you.
Yeah. So
Old.
and old in the sense
No,
that
just teaching.
I would say that it's that particular style is not old in the sense that that's the way that the early church would do that. So
I'm not that old.
yeah, so it's changed even a lot since the early church. So it would have been much more sort of rabbinical back then. So more kind of a wisdom tradition kind of approach. Now let's go to Dr. Thomas's methodology. So I'll talk a little bit about what he did yesterday. His sermon structure is called Preaching a Celebration, and you can see it on the same page, bottom right-hand corner. So this has, as you can tell, it has a little bit different movement, and the intent isn't necessarily to teach, although it will have some maybe teaching aspects to it, but rather it's intended to help people move along a journey where the text and the context are constantly being woven back and forth together. So whereas in the first box with the exegesis, interpretation, application, you have Bible, my interpretation of that, and then the context, right? So you have that kind of movement. And they're very clearly delineated between all of those kinds of boxes. With Dr. Thomas's and Dr. Henry Mitchell's movement, the text and the context aren't ever really fully separated out in that particular kind of way. So he starts out with the situation, and the situation is actually both the current context. So he began to talk about children yesterday, right? But then the situation also incorporated the situation with Pharaoh and the children. So he uses children to tie the situation between our context and the context of Exodus, the early parts of Exodus. So the situation there is an interweaving in such a way that you see not necessarily a straight map on, but at least a parallel with what's happening in our world or our local community and what's happening in the text. So in some sense, those get dovetailed together, get sort of woven together, sewn together. So that when we read Pharaoh is not just merely a historical figure in the past. Pharaoh becomes all of the ways that we have not been sufficiently life-giving to children in our current context. So now Pharaoh is standing in our world, not just merely in the Exodus text. Everybody good with that so far? Then we go to the complication. And I've already kind of started into the complication with what's impacted children. But the complication, essentially, he's doing that same thing, weaving the complications, which you can think of sort of the similar problem in the text, problem in the world. He's doing both of those things together. And so the complication is all the ways that we recognize the world or ourselves, maybe even our local churches or denominations or structures or institutions. It can be both personal, individual, it can also be social and communal. All the ways that we are sort of living counter to what God's intent for the world is. So we begin to sort of, he talked about children being so important, but then talked about all the ways that our current lives, our social lives, actually show we don't really believe that to be true. So our own sort of greed places our needs over the needs of our children. Our sort of unwillingness to tackle those difficult issues where we were talking about, he mentioned climate change, poverty, you could say education. There's a lot of different things that impact our children, but we are so worried about the current moment in our fear that we are unable to begin to look toward the future, which will be impacted for our children. And so that complication there, he brings again the text, which he says Pharaoh also begins to look at Goshen and doesn't know Joseph's story, doesn't know the people there, and all that he can see them as is a liability. If the other nations rise against them, the Israelites in Goshen will probably do the same. And so we need to put them under hard labor. And we're going to kill off their children. We're going to exterminate them. They become problematic. So there's the complication. So he's weaving both of those back and forth together so that the lines between Egypt and our current context become blurred. That make sense? And what he's essentially doing then is allowing the text to relive in the current moment. And then he begins to go to the resolution. So what is the resolution? He begins to go to the Shifras and the Puas. He goes into the life of Jesus in response to the disciples, that the kingdom belongs to these, the children, right? And again, even there, he's weaving back and forth both the text and our current context. We have the owners in the basement, as Kyle reminded us this morning, and meanwhile, those who are needing to repent to get into the kingdom hold all the power upstairs. So there's that distinction. But the resolution is the movement of God towards the children, God's own concern for children, for the vulnerable, that the kingdom is actually given to those that we would say are not the power players in the world, or the decision makers, or the holders of the keys, whatever it might be. So that resolution begins to talk about the complication and how God is responding to that complication, and maybe in some sense how the church, either positively or negatively, has but I would say he probably gives a really positive examples there about how the gospel can be played out how God is engaged for the sake of children, but then he goes and talks about Mr. Rogers. So that begins the work of the resolution. This gospel minister reflecting the life of Christ and being a good neighbor to children is a reflection of God's own character and nature in being a good neighbor to children. So that resolution then goes towards the celebration. And the celebration in this particular moment, celebration we tend to think of like, oh yeah, like touchdown, slam the ball, like that can be a sort of an ecstatic moment. There is that kind of celebration. But celebration just means what is the sort of emotive response to what we have heard in the good news. That could be lament and confession. So sometimes it's not just about feeling good. Sometimes it's about admitting the distance between what God's vision of the world should be and what we have created, so that recognizing that distance. At times it might be more somber, it might be grateful adoration, it might be celebration in the sense of we are praising God for the good work that God has done, or the hoped for future that is yet to come. So there's different ways you can do that. But at that moment, you're not any longer trying to walk people through the text. You're celebrating God's character, God's nature, God's activity, the hope for future that God is bringing into our midst right now. And the way that he did that was by, again, using Mr. Rogers as sort of a figure of Jesus standing in our midst by saying, I'll give you 10 seconds. I'll keep the time. So when he did that, essentially, he invited response from the congregation there. This was a reflective kind of response, so it wasn't the sort of emotive outburst that we might think of celebration as, but it was a reflective giving thanks for the voices that had shaped us when we were children, and an invitation to also remember what it was like to be a child when people poured into us, which was then an invitation to go and do the same for the children that we engage with in our lives, in our churches, our schools, whatever it might be. So, at least in terms of the structure, do you see kind of how that impacts both the delivery, the experience, and sort of what the end game is in terms of that sermon preaching moment, how the sermon structure can impact all of that? Is that making sense?
Mm-hmm.
Any questions or thoughts, reflections?
Does the emotive response always have to come or need to come with some sort of marching orders, some sort of go and do likewise, or is the response in the moment enough to land the plane? You know what I mean? So yesterday he just invited us to sit and be in that for a moment, but is there, we're a preaching conference, so it's a little bit different,
Mm-hmm.
We're preaching to a bunch of preachers, so you do things a little bit differently, but on a Sunday morning, would your expectation be not just to reflect on it, but to have some sort of, now go with this, because of this, we do this,
So you can do a couple of different things. I'm hesitant to always give sort of like marching orders, partly because I don't necessarily want to diminish the imagination of my congregation to think in ways that maybe I wouldn't think. So in some sense, if I say this is what we have to do and I give kind of steps or whatever it might be, I might actually hinder the possibility of them thinking something that I would never have considered before. So I'm not saying we shouldn't ever do that.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, at least for us, so Becca, she and I co-pastor together, and we're married too as well. So one of the things that we do often in our preaching is we actually move to Eucharist immediately, and not as sort of a separate piece from the sermon, but we actually weave it into the sermon. So it becomes a reminder for us that it is God's grace that is available to us, even in the sermon. And that actually is a response to come to the altar, to come forward, to receive with open hands. And then we are always, at the conclusion of the worship service, we are sent out. So we have our benediction, but we also have a sending that we do as part of that.
Right.
So it's always a reminder that even if the sermon itself doesn't have specifics, the liturgy or the worship structure itself does. The other piece, David Busick preached a sermon here in chapel years ago when we still were doing chapel. I was a student, and the sermon, it's still one of the most vivid sermons I have experienced because it was visceral. It hit me in my gut. He was talking about issues around poverty and the sort of call of God in the midst of poverty. So he's giving all these just heavy statistics about how poverty impacts the world, how it impacts our communities, it impacts children, just the overwhelming sense. And he was doing give us this day our daily bread. He was preaching out of the Lord's Prayer. At the very conclusion of that, he did not resolve it at all. He had given us all those numbers, and then he said, go in peace. And that's how he ended it. He didn't give any sort of resolution to the sermon, nothing. And at least me internally, I felt like, like, you want it all sort of like wrapped up in this nice bow, and he just did not do that at all. And so, like, it felt like the sermon was unresolved because the issue of poverty was unresolved. And I had some kind of responsibility then to help finish the sermon. Because even in just saying, go in grace and peace, what he was saying in that particular moment is, as those who have received gift upon gift from this gracious God, my responsibility is not to hoard that gift, but then to also go and serve. So he didn't give marching orders, he didn't say anything about that, but that sermon continues to play in my mind all the time. So every time I come to a bridge here in Kansas City and I see somebody sitting on the side of the highway, my tendency is to roll down the window and talk with them. So this last week I was going from my daughter's soccer practice on Thursday night, going home, and we stopped at a red light, and there was a lady on the side of the road with a sign, and I didn't have money, and I told her as much. I said, I'm sorry, I don't have money on me, but how can I help? And she said I could use prayer. I said, I'm happy to do that. And I asked her name, and so she gave me her name and all that kind of thing. So now, I still see her on that corner. So I'm trying to find ways of continuing to connect with her and to pray for her as I'm going through my day. So I think, that sermon continues, and that was 2013. Mm-hmm. It's almost a decade later, and that sermon is still working on me. Yeah, that's good.
He actually left it like, if you have peace, which you're supposed to, right?
Right.
But you're not meeting the needs of the poor, you don't really have peace. So he left that conflict there.
He did, yeah. He did it intentionally.
And to go in peace is to go as a peacemaker,
Right.
not just having personal peace, but affecting peace.
To seek the well-being of others.
Right.
Yeah, but I think that's part of the calling of preaching too, is how it ends. Am I gonna put a bow on this?
Mm-hmm.
We ran into this, we went through probably 3 years at College Church of ending second service with Eucharist every time. Well, not every sermon lends itself to that. Not every message leaves you that way. And our new pastor came in and took me to lunch. I just attend now, and I become the layman I used to preach against, and I skip some Sundays. But he took me out and said, "Is it going to be a problem? Because sometimes I want a different response." And I said, "No, that's the job of the pastor, is to determine what that response is." Dave felt like, and I think too, this is what I rebelled against when I was in college, and still have a little rebel in me, when they were trying to teach us these methods of preaching. No one ever left room, and it's because we were in a school and you have to grade somebody. And so everybody needs to be using the same method on this same
Right.
text. I think the text also determines where you
It does.
go
Yeah,
and tells you, which is why I'm very fond, I've seen you do this before, I'm fond of this.
Yeah.
Because this gives you, more arrows, if you will.
Yeah.
To say, this is where this text is going.
yeah,
This is where it needs to end. And, cause I was taught 3 chords in a cloud of dust,
right.
boom, and this is done, and sometimes the text has got 4.
Yeah.
Sometimes it has 1.
Right.
And sometimes it's just, I have to leave you,
Hang on.
yeah,
Yeah.
so,
That's good.
Yeah.
good stuff.
If you preach the end of Job, the text leaves you hanging.
Mhm.
So maybe we shouldn't resolve it either.
Mhm.
So sometimes you have to, when you're going through it, too, and this is a great point, Ron, thank you. The sermon text itself, what is it trying to do in the community that it was communicating to? We can't always fully discern that, but what is it trying to do? So if it's a narrative, it's trying to help us take a journey that might surprise us, like thinking of parable, for instance. It's a story that's utilized and then kind of throws you upside down and, sort of surprises you. So if you do a sort of didactic, teaching kind of thing, it sort of loses its impact potentially. So you have to be careful with that. Now, reading Paul is very teaching kind of methodology. Like he's very, he's a rabbi. So he does teaching. So in that sense, like the exegesis kinds of pieces with a sort of didactic, that fits really well with what Paul's trying to do. So sometimes that may be necessary. So allow the text to kind of set the agenda, and then allow the sermon structure, and there's all sorts, you can create structure, but allow that structure to reflect what the text is trying to do. So here's another example. If we preach the Psalms, for instance, which are poetry, music, has a musicality to it, it's not a logical kind of treatise. It's the emotive, gut-wrenching, wrestling with the realities of life, and sometimes, depending on the psalm, obviously, but depending on, it's wrestling where when life doesn't seem to be going in the way that you expect it to, where's God at? And oftentimes in the psalm, after they've wrestled with that, they affirm that God's still at work and present and, lifted high on the throne. There's all sorts of ways but it's musical, it's poetry, it's not simply like logical thinking in that sense, so you can't argue these things. And it's the same thing like when you're sitting in a hospital room, and it's not the time to be logical, it's the time to be poetic and to listen and to reflect and to grieve. But one of the ways that you can do that then is to incorporate poetry and music into the sermon, and that can be actually a great way to conclude a sermon. This is really pretty significantly used in the African American context, but the way that sermons will be concluded is by singing, weaving that into the song. So here's a really corny example I did years ago. John 1, one of my favorite texts, talking about the light of the world and how that light is just on the cusp of being extinguished, and yet the light is not conquered. And then as the conclusion of that, we are called to be like Christ, light in the world. So I sang This Little Light of Mine, right? It's a very simple, again, incorporating children, but everybody knows that song. Everybody knows, so that was a really simple way of, and that song is so deeply ingrained in many of us who grew up in the church that it's heart language song. So you don't have to, I didn't have to have words up, people just could sing it. And so it became a time of response, of worship, and at the same time ascending. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. So that became the sending. I didn't even have to say anything. We're going out as Christ has been in this world as light. Other reflections, questions?
Sometimes it's a catchphrase.
Yeah.
That will be going off in their head for the next week and actually teaching the lesson as it goes.
Yeah. And Frank Thomas actually did that. So that's another part of structure within. So using language to structure itself. So repetition is actually can be a really good, powerful tool. Becca uses this a lot and does it really masterfully. But that theme, what about the children? What about the children? What about the children? That rhythm is a structure that keeps playing. It's the beat that keeps playing as he weaves the music around that beat. But that then sets the agenda. That's the thread that ties all of that together as he goes through. So even language, and so we will even structure, so when we think of like some of the great preachers like Gardner C. Taylor, the way that some of them will create this sense of like, oh, wow, is structure.
Yeah.
So I mentioned this at the beginning of the conference when he's preaching out of Philippians 2, Gardner C. Taylor talks about Christ who has humbled himself, God who has put on flesh. And in Christ, God has become time-trapped, pain-capable, and death-eligible. So he both uses rhythm as a structure, so da-da, pain-capable, death-eligible. So there's that, and then he stacks the language. So the way that he talks about humility and putting on the flesh, he begins to talk about what that means for this God who is eternal, this God who has all power, to then step down and put on flesh and become vulnerable. So he builds that imagery, that sense of, wow, this is who God is. This is the way that God has entered the world. And it has this significant impact. Like every time I hear that sermon, I weep because it's just so powerful. But the way that he does it is through structure. Now, I want to be careful and say this is not like technique. This is not a way to just try to figure out how to manipulate people. We have to do this very prayerfully, carefully, wisely, because we are in positions of power when we're preaching in those moments, and we have to be careful that we're not just trying to manipulate people. But at the same time, those structures are a necessary vehicle for helping us to communicate the gospel and to help people be impacted by the gospel. And so I really do think structure is really a great tool if we pay attention to it that can really help serve the work that we do when we're preaching, but even beyond preaching, when we're writing, as we're having conversation, to think about what is it that's going to be most helpful as I'm having this conversation or this preaching opportunity. You know what time it is real quick?
It's 9:44.
9:44. Okay, we do a couple minutes. Yeah.
In a lot of our worship services, especially on like a Sunday morning, traditionally a lot of services close with a song. So as those of us who are preaching the sermon, what's our responsibility to connect with whoever might be leading that song to make, is it our responsibility to make sure that our closing song always connects with our message, or how does it flow, or I don't know, how are there specific structures that lean more into having a closing song with it? I'm just thinking as a worship leader.
You can be pretty flexible on how you want to do that. At least for me and for Becca, we try our best to make sure that everything is woven together and reflects the sort of general theme of the sermon itself. And so if we do have a concluding song, most of the time we will at least recommend maybe some songs, or this is kind of the focus that we want to at least have, and have some freedom for the music director to be able to select something that would work. But that doesn't always happen. Some songs are just, some sermon text, there's not going to be a song you're going to be able to really figure out that will fit.
Right.
And so in those particular cases, you might think more along the lines of, what are the sort of maybe bigger theological ideas that I would want to maybe communicate in this sort of concluding moment, that helps us to be sent out of this place.
One structure I remember that I really was impressed was he told a story at the first with no resolution at the end. And then in his sermon, he used the biblical text to answer that and connected the two at the end. I was like, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, it can have some really wonderful impact on how you experience the text anew. Other thoughts, comments, questions? I know I kind of did a quick rundown of all that, but.
That's good. Dr. Don Dunn, who's a longtime preaching prophet in America, is really good at coming up with alliterations and cue phrases and things like that. That I'm not good at that. Like that's not where I go. But he was the pastor at the church where I am for 20 whatever years, and people still remember sermons that he preached because of the three things, you know, that all rhymed, that he was said rhythmically throughout or whatever. Like he's really good at that. So
That's a skill he's had for.
yeah, I recognize the impact of that. It's not me, and I've even tried it, and I feel like I'm really stretching when I do.
Yeah.
You know, but I recognize the value of it in just the longevity, like the way his sermons have held throughout years. for
Yeah.
people. So I wonder, you know, like for myself, you know, centering myself in the conversation as we all are want to do. Like, how are my sermons going to hold for people since I don't have the cue phrases? You know, like what is it about what I'm preaching now that are going to continue to impact people? And again, that's over centering myself. I recognize that I'm not the center of the equation here, but the text is and the Spirit is. But still, just thinking of myself as a preacher, you know, like what's that going to look like?
Yeah, so one thought, not every sermon structure will be conducive to your work in preaching. Some will feel much more natural, so I would say don't wear Saul's armor. Use the kinds of things that you feel comfortable with. So, for instance, although I kind of talked about the 4 pages and, you know, I kind of deconstructed it a little bit. When I'm first teaching people a structure to preach out of, I will typically use that just because it's really easy to understand and use. And it's not a bad tool for also developing study habits for the preaching moment and how you do develop that. So initially, I tell them, like, use a simple structure like that. Then once you become, like, comfortable with that structure, then start to expand. Play with it a little bit. It's okay for us, so thinking of this, like, when I have sports analogy, when I have young kids that start playing basketball, I'm not going to ask them to go behind the back and reverse layup. I'm going to ask them to do the really simple things of, like, make sure you're balanced. I don't care if the shot's pretty, just get it up there. But, like, you got to be balanced. So I'm going to start just working on basic foundation piece first. And then as you start being able to develop that skill, then I'll add, oh, you got to get your elbow in. You know, you gotta start adding some pieces to that. Same thing with structure. Like, as you develop a structure, as you work with the structure and you become comfortable with that, then you can start sort of playing with that structure or expanding structures and say, this feels more natural to what this is part of, like, maybe more towards my voice. So I'm with you, Kyle, because I can't do the alliteration piece either. There's things that I, you know, are going to be more gifted at than alliteration. So the kinds of things that I would tend towards would maybe be a little bit more narrative. And so I'll tend to use those structures a little bit more and just find ways of incorporating things like when I have to do more teaching, I'll find ways of being a little more didactic through that methodology. So there's, again, you can kind of adapt those structures. All right, well, I think we're at the end of our time, but thank you for being here. Feel free to contact me if you have questions or anything like that. Always love talking about preaching resources and however I can be helpful.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thanks for being here.